They say the devil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes he wears a southern smile, a preacher's name, and carries a .38 special tucked into his waistband. In the sweltering back roads of Mississippi, where the Bible Belt meets the bootlegger's highway, there walked a man who would become known as one of the most brutal enforcers the Dixie Mafia ever produced. His name was W.J. Billy Sunday, and his legacy was written in blood across the Deep South. This is not a story of honor among thieves. This is a story of pure, unfiltered violence, the kind that leaves scars on an entire region and whispers that still echo through the pine trees of the Gulf Coast. Before Billy Sunday became a nightmare, he was just another forgotten child of the South. Born into poverty and rage, William Joseph Sunday entered this world in 1940. In a shotgun shack outside of Meridian, Mississippi, a place where the air hung thick with humidity and hopelessness. His father was a dock worker who drank away his paychecks and beat his wife with the same calloused hands that loaded freight cars. His mother, a frail woman named Doris, worked as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding over fabric while her children went hungry. Billy was the middle child of 5, visible in the chaos of a household that ran on rage and desperation. The South in the 1940s was a place of contradictions. On the surface, it preached God, family, and community. Underneath, it festered with corruption, racism, and a criminal underclass that operated with near impunity. For poor white families like the Sundays, there was no upward mobility, no American dream. There was only survival. And for Billy, survival meant learning to fight before he learned to read. By the age of 7, Billy had already witnessed his first murder. A neighbor, drunk on moonshine, had stabbed another man over a card game in the dirt yard behind their homes. Billy watched from a window as the man bled out, gurgling and clawing at the red Mississippi clay. Nobody called the police. Nobody talked about it. The body was gone by morning, and life went on. That night taught Billy Sunday a lesson that would define his entire existence. Violence was the currency of power. And nobody was coming to save you. School was a joke for Billy. He attended sporadically, more interested in the world outside the classroom than anything a teacher could offer. He was a scrappy kid, small for his age, but wiry and mean. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quick temper. By the time he was 10, he was already running with a pack of older boys, stealing cigarettes from corner stores and breaking into parked cars. The local sheriff knew Billy by name, but in those days, juvenile delinquency was handled with a belt, not a courtroom. Billy learned early that if you were going to get beaten either way, you might as well make it worth it. His father died when Billy was 12, liver failure, rotted from the inside out by cheap whiskey. There was no funeral, just a quick burial in a pauper's grave. Billy didn't cry. He stood at the edge of that hole in the ground and felt nothing but relief. The old man was gone, and with him went the worst of the beatings. But the damage was already done. Billy had learned to associate love with pain, safety with violence. He had learned that the world respected only one thing: the willingness to hurt people with his father dead. Billy became the man of the house at 12 years old. He dropped out of school permanently and took whatever work he could find loading trucks, cleaning out warehouses, running errands for shopkeepers who paid him under the table. But honest work didn't pay enough to feed a family of 6. So Billy started stealing in earnest. He graduated from cigarettes to cash registers, from petty theft to breaking and entering. He was careful, methodical, and utterly without fear. The local cops picked him up a few times, roughed him up, and sent him home. But Billy kept coming back, bolder, each time at 15. Billy Sunday met the man who would change his life forever: Luther "Big Luke" Hollingsworth, a mid-level crook who ran gambling operations and bootlegging routes through Lauderdale County. Big Luke was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle and menace. He took a liking to the skinny kid with the dead eyes who didn't flinch when threatened. Big Luke saw something useful in Billy Sunday, a boy with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Big Luke put Billy to work as a runner, delivering illegal whiskey to juke joints and roadhouses across the county. It was dangerous work. Revenuers and rival bootleggers were always lurking, and a teenager on the back roads with a trunk full of moonshine was an easy target. But Billy thrived in the danger. He learned the routes, memorized the safe houses, and figured out which cops could be bribed and which ones couldn't. More importantly, he learned how to handle himself when things went wrong. One night, when Billy was 16, he was ambushed by two men working for a rival operation. They jumped him at a lonely crossroads, intending to steal his cargo and send a message to Big Luke. Billy took a tire iron to the face and went down hard, blood pouring from a split above his eye. But as one of the men reached for the whiskey bottles, Billy pulled a knife from his boot, a long, wicked blade he'd taken from his father's toolbox years before. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He drove that knife into the first man's kidney, twisted it, and pulled it free. The man dropped like a stone. The second man ran, disappearing into the darkness. Billy left the body in the ditch, drove the whiskey to its destination, and never said a word about what happened. Big Luke heard about the incident through the grapevine. Instead of reprimanding Billy, he promoted him. The kid had proven he could kill without remorse, without panic. That was rare. That was valuable. Billy Sunday was no longer just a runner. He was an enforcer in training. The next few years were Billy's education in the criminal underworld. Big Luke introduced him to the broader network of criminals operating across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, the loose confederation of hustlers, killers, and conmen that would later be known as the Dixie Mafia. Unlike the Italian Mafia or the Irish mobs of the North, the Dixie Mafia had no formal structure, no code of honor, no rules beyond self-preservation and profit. It was a brotherhood of outlaws bound only by geography and greed. And it was perfect for a man like Billy Sunday. Billy learned to run card games and protection rackets. He learned how to intimidate witnesses and corrupt officials. He learned where to dump bodies so they'd never be found, swamps, bayous, and abandoned wells scattered across the rural South. And most importantly, he learned that reputation was everything. If people feared you, they'd pay you. If they didn't fear you, you were just another hustler waiting to get robbed or killed. Billy Sunday built his reputation one beating at a time, one broken bone at a time, until his name was spoken in whispers across the back roads of the Gulf Coast. By the time he turned 20, Billy Sunday was no longer the skinny kid from Meridian. He was a lean, hard man with scars on his knuckles and a coldness in his eyes that made even hardened criminals uneasy. He wore his nickname Billy Sunday after the famous evangelist preacher with bitter irony. There was nothing holy about him. He was a demon dressed in denim and bootleg leather, and he was just getting started. The South in the 1960s was a powder keg, and Billy Sunday was a lit match. The civil rights movement was tearing the region apart, and in the chaos, men like Billy thrived. While the world's attention was on marches and protests, the Dixie Mafia was expanding its operations, moving from moonshine and gambling into drugs, prostitution, and contract killings. Billy Sunday was ready to rise, and when he did, the South would never be the same. Every empire begins with a single act of audacity. For Billy Sunday, that moment came on a humid August night in 1963, in a cinder-block roadhouse just outside of Biloxi, Mississippi. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap beer. A poker game was underway in the back room, a high-stakes game involving local heavies, bent cops, and a visiting Chicago mobster looking to establish connections down south. Billy Sunday wasn't invited, but he walked in anyway. He was 23 years old, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark slacks, a snub-nosed .38 tucked into his belt. He'd heard about the game through the grapevine, heard that $10,000 was sitting on the table. $10,000 that belonged to men who wouldn't miss a tour, so he thought. Billy walked past the bar, ignored the bartender's warning look, and pushed open the door to the back room. 6 men looked up from their cards, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The Chicago mobster, a man named Vincent Carlucci, set down his hand and stared at Billy with the kind of cold appraisal that comes from a lifetime of violence. "Kid, you lost." Carlucci's voice was smooth, almost polite. Billy smiled a thin, humorless smile. Land drew his pistol in one fluid motion. "No, sir," he said. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Everybody, put your hands on the table. This'll be quick." What happened next would become legend in the Dixie Mafia. Carlucci, instead of complying, reached for his own weapon. Billy shot him twice, once in the chest, once in the throat. The room erupted in chaos. One of the local cops pulled his service revolver, and Billy shot him through the hand, sending the gun clattering to the floor. The other men froze, realizing they were in the presence of someone who didn't bluff, didn't hesitate, didn't care. Billy scooped the cash off the table, stuffed it into a canvas bag, and backed out of the room, his gun still leveled at the remaining players. "Anyone follows me, you'll end up like your friend from Chicago," he said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The fallout from that robbery should have been catastrophic. Vincent Carlucci was connected to the outfit in Chicago, and killing a made man of a low level, one should have brought a death sentence. But Billy Sunday had gambled correctly. The Chicago mob didn't want a war in the South, especially not over a guy who'd been freelancing without permission. And the local cops. They were too dirty to push the issue. Reporting the robbery would have meant explaining what they were doing in an illegal poker game in the first place. So Vincent Carlucci was buried quietly. And the story of Billy Sunday's audacity spread like wildfire through the criminal underworld. Overnight, Billy went from being a mid-level enforcer to a name everyone knew. Men who'd never heard of him suddenly wanted to work with him more, stay the hell out of his way. Big Luke Hollingsworth, his old mentor, was furious at first. Billy had acted without permission, without backup, and had risked bringing heat down on the entire operation. But when Billy showed up at Big Luke's door with $5,000 cash as a peace offering, half the take from the robbery, Big Luke's anger melted into grudging respect. "You got balls, kid," Big Luke said, counting the bills. "Just make sure they don't get you killed." But Billy wasn't content to be just another gun for hire. He wanted more. He wanted territory, control, respect. The Dixie Mafia was expanding rapidly in the mid-1960s, moving into prostitution, drugs, and loan sharking. The Mississippi Gulf Coast, with its casinos, strip clubs, and corrupt politicians, was a goldmine waiting to be exploited. Billy Sunday saw an opportunity, and he took it. He started by taking over a string of illegal gambling dens in Biloxi and Gulfport. These operations had been loosely controlled by various small-time crooks, none of whom had the muscle or the will to resist Billy Sunday. He walked into each establishment, made his pitch or his threat tanned, walked out with a piece of the action. Those who resisted found their businesses burned to the ground, or worse. One gambler who refused to pay Billy's protection fee was found hanging from a tree in a public park. His body left as a message. The police investigated half-heartedly and closed the case as a suicide. Nobody believed it. Nobody cared. Billy's reputation grew darker, more fearsome. He wasn't just ruthless, he was theatrical in his brutality, making examples out of those who crossed him. He understood that fear was a tool, and he wielded it like a master craftsman. Stories circulated about Billy Sunday torturing a debtor with a blowtorch. about him feeding a snitch to the alligators in the Pascagoula swamps, about him beating a man to death with a Bible in a church parking lot. Some of the stories were true. Some were exaggerated. Billy never confirmed or denied any of them. He let the legend grow, because the legend did half his work for him. By 1965, Billy Sunday controlled a significant portion of the illegal gambling on the Gulf Coast. But gambling was small time compared to what was coming. The real money, the kind of money that could make a man untouchable, was in drugs. Marijuana, pills, and eventually heroin were flooding into the South through the Gulf ports, smuggled in from Mexico and South America. The Dixie Mafia was perfectly positioned to distribute it, and Billy Sunday was perfectly positioned to take over that distribution. He partnered with a smuggler named Remy Gautier, a Cajun from Louisiana who ran cigarette boats between New Orleans and the coastal islands. Remy had connections in Mexico and a fleet of fast boats that could outrun the Coast Guard. Together, they established a pipeline that moved hundreds of pounds of marijuana and thousands of pills every month. Billy handled the distribution network, using his gambling operations as fronts and paying off local cops to look the other way. The money poured in tens of thousands of dollars a month, more than Billy had ever imagined. With wealth came power, and with power came enemies. Other factions within the Dixie Mafia began to see Billy Sunday as a threat. He was too ambitious, too violent, too unpredictable. Some of the older bosses, men who'd been running operations since the bootlegging days, wanted him taken down a peg. But Billy was always one step ahead. He cultivated relationships with corrupt politicians, judges, and police chiefs, building a network of protection that made him nearly untouchable. He also surrounded himself with a crew of enforcers who were as loyal and as brutal as he was. Men like Jimmy the Knife Boudreaux, a half-Creole killer with a taste for close-quarters violence, and Ray Dunn Mackey, a former Marine who'd learned his trade in the jungles of Vietnam in 1967. A rival faction made a move against Billy. A bomb was planted in his car, set to detonate when he turned the ignition. But Billy had gotten paranoid. Paranoia was a survival skill in his line of work, and had started having his cars checked every morning by Ray Dunn, who'd learned about explosives in the war. Ray Dunn found the bomb, carefully disarmed it. And Billy knew exactly who was responsible. A crew out of Mobile led by a man named Curtis Landry. Billy didn't call a sit-down. He didn't negotiate. He went to war. Over the next 3 weeks, Billy and his crew systematically dismantled Curtis Landry's operation. They torched his warehouses, killed his top lieutenants, and finally caught Landry himself at a motel outside of Pascagoula. The details of what happened in that motel room were never fully confirmed, but witnesses reported hearing screams for hours. Curtis Landry's body was found the next morning, mutilated beyond recognition, his tongue cut out and nailed to the wall. It was a message. Billy Sunday did not forgive, and he did not forget by the end of the 1960s. Billy Sunday was one of the most powerful criminals in the Deep South. He was pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, living in a sprawling house overlooking the Gulf, driving Cadillacs, and wearing custom-tailored suits. He'd gone from a nobody in Meridian to a king of the underworld. But with every step up, the fall became steeper. And Billy Sunday, for all his intelligence and ruthlessness, had one fatal flaw. He believed he was invincible. By 1970, Billy Sunday's name was spoken in the same breath as legends. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a brand, a myth, a symbol of everything dark and dangerous about the New South. His empire stretched from the Mississippi Gulf Coast to the Florida Panhandle, a sprawling network of gambling dens, drug routes, prostitution rings, and protection rackets. Law enforcement knew his name. Politicians whispered it in back rooms and on the streets. Saying you worked for Billy Sunday was like carrying a loaded gun. It commanded instant respect and instant fear. Billy's headquarters was a nightclub called the Dixie Rose, a neon-lit palace of sign on the Biloxi Strip. From the outside, it looked like any other beachside club: flashy signs, loud music, tourists stumbling in and out. But in the back rooms, behind velvet curtains and locked doors, Billy Sunday ran his empire. This was where deals were made, where debts were collected, where traitors were brought to face judgment. The Dixie Rose had a basement that only Billy's inner circle knew about. It had a drain in the floor. That drain had seen more blood than most emergency rooms. Money flowed through Billy's hands like water. At his peak, he was clearing $500,000 a year, an astronomical sum for the early 1970s, especially in the South. He bought a mansion on the coast, a sprawling estate with white columns and a view of the Gulf that stretched to the horizon. He owned a fleet of Cadillacs, wore diamond rings, and kept a mistress in every city. He threw parties that attracted minor celebrities, crooked politicians, and anyone else who wanted a taste of the forbidden life. Billy Sunday had become exactly what he'd always wanted: untouchable. But empires built on blood are maintained with blood, and Billy's reign was soaked in it. He'd long since stopped doing his own dirty work. He had men for that, but his orders were absolute. Cross Billy Sunday, and you disappeared. Skim from his operations, and your family got a visit. Talk to the cops, and you ended up in pieces, scattered across the bayous where the gators would finish the job. Billy didn't believe in second chances. He believed in lessons, and his lessons were permanent. One of the most infamous incidents of Billy's reign happened in the summer of Key. I want to color say rove. The elufture of qua, lovey kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on smoothly and leaves a wretch long-lasting color. He believed in lessons, and his lessons were poorly psychutious, and his lessons were permanent. One made civi sevend, my laze, my lessides, my lessaid, my lessuid, ma sev, my les, we is, we oughta me lev, we may not si claw the say seseded, be an you saki you see to be with a casit to me sit secute acid it lit sit stick to split asa me su see it to 1971. A young hustler named Donnie Farrell, ambitious and stupid in equal measure, decided he could carve out his own territory by taking over one of Billy's smaller gambling operations in Pascagoula. Donnie had muscle a few ex-cons who thought they were toughened. He made his move quickly, showing up at the gambling den with guns and demands. The manager called Billy immediately. Billy's response was calm, almost pleasant. Tell Donnie I'd like to have a conversation. Invite him to the Dixie Rose tomorrow night. Tell him I want to work something out. Donnie, convinced he'd actually gained leverage, showed up the next night with 2 bodyguards. They were escorted to the back room, offered drinks, treated like guests. Billy greeted Donnie with a handshake and a smile. They talked business for 20 minutes: territory, percentages, respect. Donnie started to relax. That's when Billy nodded to Jimmy, the knife boudreaux. Jimmy moved faster than anyone could react, burying a hunting knife into the first bodyguard's throat. Ray Don Mackey shot the second bodyguard twice in the chest before he could even draw his weapon. Donnie Farrell tried to run. Billy grabbed him by the collar, slammed him into the wall, and looked him dead in the eyes. You thought you could take from me? Billy's voice was low, almost a whisper. You thought I'd let that slide? What happened next became the stuff of nightmares in the criminal underworld. Billy Sunday beat Donnie Farrell to death with his own hands, methodically, without rage, just cold, mechanical violence. It took 15 minutes. When it was over, Billy washed his hands in the sink, adjusted his tie, and walked back out to the club like nothing had happened. Donnie's body, along with his 2 bodyguards, was dumped in the Gulf, weighted down with chains. They were never found. But everyone heard the story. And the message was clear. Billy Sunday's empire was not for sale. But Billy's brutality wasn't just about control, What's about fear? And fear, like any weapon, can backfire. By the early 1970s, federal law enforcement was starting to take notice of the Dixie Mafia. The FBI had always viewed Southern organized crime as a sideshow compared to the Italian Mafia. But bodies were piling up, and politicians who couldn't be bought were starting to ask questions. Billy Sunday's name kept appearing in reports, always just out of reach, protected by layers of corrupt cops and paid-off officials. But the feds were patient, and they were building a case. Billy knew the heat was coming. He could feel it. Informants were being flipped, wiretaps were going up, and some of his own crew were getting nervous. Paranoia, always Billy's companion, became his obsession. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest men. He started carrying a gun everywhere, even to bed. He had his food tasted before he ate it. He changed his routine constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. The life that had once felt like a kingdom now felt like a prison, with walls closing in inch by inch in 1972. Billy made a decision that would define the beginning of his end. He ordered the murder of a local sheriff who'd refused to stay bought. Sheriff Tom Hackett was a rare breed in the South, a lawman who actually tried to do his job. He'd been investigating Billy's operations for months, and Billy decided the problem needed to be eliminated. It was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong. Jimmy the Knife and Ray Don ambushed Hackett outside a diner, shot him 6 times, and fled. But they were sloppy. A witness saw the car. A forensic team found a shell casing that linked back to a gun used in another murder. And suddenly, the feds had a thread to pull. The death of Sheriff Hackett changed everything. It wasn't just another murder. It was the murder of a cop, and cops, even dirty ones, protect their own. The FBI poured resources into the investigation. Informants who'd been too scared to talk suddenly found their courage when offered witness protection. Billy's network, so carefully constructed, began to crack. One of his lower-level guys, a runner named Eddie Thibodeau, got picked up on a drug charge and flipped immediately, spilling everything he knew. Then another informant came forward, and another. Billy tried to stem the bleeding. He ordered hits on suspected informants. 2 men disappeared in the span of a week. But the feds were moving faster now, and Billy's paranoia was making him reckless. He lashed out at his own crew, accusing men of disloyalty based on nothing more than gut instinct. Some of his most loyal enforcers started to wonder if Billy had lost his mind. The empire, so fearsome just a year before, was starting to eat itself from the inside. And then, in the spring of 1973, disaster struck. Ray Don Mackey, Billy's most trusted enforcer, was arrested after a shootout with federal agents. Ray Don was looking at life in prison, maybe even the death penalty. The feds offered him a deal: testify against Billy Sunday and walk away with a reduced sentence. Ray Don, who'd killed more than a dozen men for Billy, who'd been with him since the beginning, took the deal. When Billy found out, he didn't rage. He didn't scream. He just sat in his office at the Dixie Rose, staring out at the Gulf, and knew that the end was near. The empire of Billy Sunday, built on blood and fear, was crumbling. The feds were closing in. His allies were abandoning him. And the man who'd once believed he was untouchable was about to learn the oldest lesson in the criminal world: no one stays on top forever. The wolves were at the door, and Billy Sunday could hear them howling. It was the fall of 1973, and the world that Billy had built, the empire of fear. And blood was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Federal agents were everywhere. Surveillance teams parked outside his properties. Wiretaps on every phone line he might use. The Dixie Rose, once a palace of sin and power, now felt like a tomb. Billy Sunday, the demon of the Gulf Coast, was running out of places to hide. The indictment came down in October. 37 counts: racketeering, drug trafficking, murder, conspiracy, witness tampering. The list went on. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young attorney from Atlanta named Mitchell Crane, held a press conference and declared that the era of lawlessness in the Deep South was coming to an end. Billy Sunday's mugshot cold eyes, thin smile. Hair slicked back was plastered across newspapers from Mississippi to Florida. The man who'd operated in shadows was suddenly dragged into the light, and the light was merciless. Billy's first instinct was to run. He had money stashed in banks under fake names, properties in Mexico, contacts who could get him across the border. But running meant admitting defeat, and Billy Sunday had never admitted defeat in his life. More importantly, running meant abandoning the empire he'd built, the reputation he'd killed for. So instead, Billy decided to fight. He hired the best defense attorneys his dirty money could be, a team of slick, ruthless lawyers who specialized in getting guilty men off on technicalities. The trial was set for January 1974, and Billy prepared for war, but the cracks in his armor were already showing. His crew, once loyal to the death, was fracturing. Some of his top men had already fled the state, sensing that the ship was sinking. Others were quietly cooperating with federal investigators, trading information for immunity. The betrayal that hurt the most was Ray Don McKee's. Ray Don had been Billy's right hand, his enforcer, his brother, in everything but blood. And now Ray Don was sitting in a federal facility rehearsing his testimony, ready to bury the man he'd once called boss. Billy's paranoia, always a low hum in the background, exploded into full-blown mania. He trusted no one. He saw traitors everywhere. He started carrying 2 guns instead of 1, slept with a shotgun next to his bed, and refused to eat anything he hadn't prepared himself. His mistress, a woman named Lorraine, who'd been with him for 3 years, tried to leave. Billy wouldn't let her. He locked her in the mansion, convinced she was planning to testify against him. She escaped through a second-story window one night and went straight to the police. Her testimony would later add kidnapping and false imprisonment too. Billy's charges. The preliminary hearings were a circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the notorious Billy Sunday in chains. Billy showed up in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, defiant. He stared down the prosecutor, smirked at the judge, and played the role of the unbreakable outlaw. But behind the bravado, he was drowning. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The feds had wiretaps, financial records, testimony from a dozen informants. They had Ray Don Mackey ready to detail every murder, every deal, every dirty secret. In December, just weeks before the trial, Billy's legal team approached him with a deal. The feds were offering a plea bargain: plead guilty to racketeering and drug charges, cooperate with ongoing investigations, and accept a 20-year sentence. Billy would be in his 60s when he got out told, broken, forgotten. His lawyers urged him to take it. The alternative was risking life in prison, or worse, the death penalty for the murder charges. Billy Sunday, sitting in a holding cell, faced the most important decision of his life. And for the first time, he blinked. He told his lawyers to negotiate the deal, but before the plea could be finalized, everything went to hell. One of Billy's remaining loyalists, a low-level enforcer named Carl Wayne Dupree, decided to make a move. Carl Wayne, desperate and stupid, thought he could win Billy's favor by eliminating the biggest threat, Ray Don Mackey. On a cold night in December, Carl Wayne and another thug ambushed Ray Don outside a federal safe house in Hattiesburg. They shot him 7 times, killing him instantly, along with the 2 U.S. Marshals guarding him. It was a bloodbath, and it was national news within hours. The murder of a federal witness and 2 marshals brought the full weight of the federal government down on what was left of Billy Sunday's operation. The plea deal evaporated. The feds wanted blood now, and they wanted Billy Sunday to pay the ultimate price. His lawyers scrambled, but there was no recovering from this. The trial was moved up, the charges upgraded. Billy Sunday was now facing the death penalty. The trial began in January 1974, and it was a slaughter. The prosecution laid out Billy's entire criminal history in meticulous detail. They played wiretaps of Billy ordering murders. They brought in witnesses who testified to beatings, torture, executions. They showed photographs of crime scenes, bodies in swamps, burned-out buildings, victims who'd been made examples of. And even without Ray Don Mackey's testimony, they had enough. Carl Wayne Dupree, arrested hours after the Hattiesburg shooting, had flipped and was now testifying against Billy, desperate to save his own life. Billy's defense team tried everything, attacking the credibility of informants, arguing entrapment, claiming the evidence was circumstantial. But the jury saw through it. They saw a monster in a suit, a man who'd terrorized the Gulf Coast for over a decade. The deliberation took less than 6 hours. On February 14, 1974, Valentine's Day. A bitter irony, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the exits to file their stories. Federal agents smiled and shook hands. Billy Sunday sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his face a mask. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The prosecution was pushing for death. Billy's lawyers begged for mercy, arguing that Billy was a product of his environment, a victim of poverty and violence who'd never had a chance. The judge, a stern man named William Treadwell, listened impassively. On February 28, 1974, Judge Treadwell handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole on the racketeering and murder charges, plus an additional 90 years on drug and conspiracy charges. Billy Sunday would never see the outside of a prison again. As the bailiffs led him away, Billy turned and looked back at the courtroom one last time. Some said they saw fear in his eyes. Others said they saw only cold, empty defiance. Either way, the Dixie Mafia demon was caged. Billy Sunday was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, one of the most brutal prisons in America. Angola was a sprawling plantation turned prison, a place where violence was currency and hope went to die. Billy, once the king of the underworld, was now just another inmate in a hellhole. The fall from grace was complete. The man who'd controlled an empire was now sleeping in a 6-byte cell, surrounded by men who'd heard his name but didn't fear it anymore. And in the swamps of Mississippi, in the roadhouses and gambling dens. The story of Billy Sunday became a warning: rise to high, and the fall will destroy you. The wolves were at the door, and Billy Sunday could hear them howling. It was the fall of 1973, and the world that Billy had built, the empire of fear. Money and blood was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Federal agents were everywhere, surveillance teams parked outside his properties, wiretaps on every phone line he might use. The Dixie Rose, once a palace of sin and power, now felt like a tomb. Billy Sunday, the demon of the Gulf Coast, was running out of places to hide. The indictment came down in October. 37 counts: racketeering, drug trafficking, murder, conspiracy, witness tampering. The list went on. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young attorney from Atlanta named Mitchell Crane, held a press conference and declared that the era of lawlessness in the Deep South was coming to an end. Billy Sunday's mugshot cold eyes, thin smile, hair slicked back was plastered across newspapers from Mississippi to Florida. The man who'd operated in shadows was suddenly dragged into the light. And the light was merciless. Billy's first instinct was to run. He had money stashed in banks under fake names, properties in Mexico, contacts who could get him across the border. But running meant admitting defeat, and Billy Sunday had never admitted defeat in his life. More importantly, running meant abandoning the empire he'd built, the reputation he'd killed for. So instead, Billy decided to fight. He hired the best defense attorneys his dirty money could be, team of slick, ruthless lawyers who specialized in getting guilty men off on technicalities. The trial was set for January 1974, and Billy prepared for war, but the cracks in his armor were already showing. His crew, once loyal to the death, was fracturing. Some of his top men had already fled the state, sensing that the ship was sinking. Others were quietly cooperating with federal investigators, trading information for immunity. The betrayal that hurt the most was Ray Don Mackey's. Ray Don had been Billy's right hand, his enforcer, his brother in everything but blood. And now Ray Don was sitting in a federal facility rehearsing his testimony, ready to bury the man he'd once called boss. Billy's paranoia, always a low hum in the background, exploded into full-blown mania. He trusted no one. He saw traitors everywhere. He started carrying 2 guns instead of 1, slept with a shotgun next to his bed, and refused to eat anything he hadn't prepared himself. His mistress, a woman named Lorraine, who'd been with him for 3 years, tried to leave. Billy wouldn't let her. He locked her in the mansion, convinced she was planning to testify against him. She escaped through a second-story window one night and went straight to the police. Her testimony would later add kidnapping and false imprisonment to Billy's charges. The nights were the worst. Billy would sit in his mansion overlooking the Gulf, the same mansion he'd bought at the height of his power, and stare out at the dark water. The waves rolled in endlessly, indifferent to his fate. He'd pour himself bourbon after bourbon, drinking until the paranoia dulled to a manageable roar. Sometimes he'd take out his revolver, check the chamber, and think about eating a bullet. It would be quick. It would be on his terms. But Billy Sunday had never been a quitter, and he wasn't about to start now not when there was still a chance. However slim that he could walk away from this. The preliminary hearings were a circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, curious onlookers who wanted to see the notorious Billy Sunday in chains. Billy showed up in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, defiant. He stared down the prosecutor, smirked at the judge, and played the role of the unbreakable outlaw. But behind the bravado, he was drowning. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The feds had wiretaps, financial records, testimony from a dozen informants. They had Ray Don Mackey ready to detail every murder, every deal. Every dirty secret. Billy's lawyers fought hard during the preliminary hearings, challenging every piece of evidence, attacking the credibility of every witness. They argued that the wiretaps were illegal, that the informants were unreliable criminals looking to save their own skins, that the federal government was conducting a witch hunt against a successful Southern businessman. But Judge William Treadwell, a no-nonsense jurist who'd seen every trick in the book, wasn't buying it. He denied motion after motion, and with each denial, Billy's chances grew slimmer. Behind the scenes, Billy's world was imploding. His drug operation, once a well-oiled machine, had been completely dismantled by federal raids. His gambling dens were shuttered, his protection rackets exposed. The politicians he'd bought were running for cover, claiming they'd never heard of Billy Sunday, that any donations they'd received were perfectly legal campaign contributions. The police chiefs who'd taken his bribes were suddenly cooperating with internal affairs investigations, throwing Billy under the bus to save their own pensions. Billy had built his empire on loyalty bought with cash and fear. And now he was learning the hard truth when the money dries up and the fear fades. Loyalty evaporates like gasoline on a hot summer road. In December, just weeks before the trial, Billy's legal team approached him with a deal. The feds were offering a plea bargain: plead guilty to racketeering and drug charges. cooperate with ongoing investigations into other Dixie Mafia operations, and accept a 20-year sentence. Billy would be in his 60s when he got out told, broken, forgotten, but alive and eventually free. His lawyers urged him to take it. The alternative was risking life in prison, or worse, the death penalty for the murder charges. Billy Sunday, sitting in a holding cell at the Harrison County Jail, faced the most important decision of his life. For 3 days, Billy wrestled with the choice. Taking the deal meant becoming a rat, a snitch, the one thing he despised his entire criminal career. It meant betraying the code he'd lived by, admitting weakness, showing fear. But it also meant survival. Billy had always been a pragmatist beneath the bravado. He'd killed when he needed to kill, stolen when he needed to steal, and now, perhaps, he needed to swallow his pride and take the deal. On the 4th day, Billy told his lawyers to start negotiating the terms. He would take the plea, cooperate with the feds, and accept his 20 years. It was surrender, but it was survival. But before the ink could dry on the plea agreement, everything went straight to hell. One of Billy's remaining loyalists, a low-level enforcer named Carl Wayne Dupree, decided to make a move. Carl Wayne was a true believer, one of the few men left who still thought Billy Sunday walked on water. He was also a violent, impulsive idiot with more muscle than brains. When Carl Wayne heard through the grapevine that Billy was considering cooperating with the feds, he decided to prove his loyalty by eliminating the biggest threat to Billy's empire, Ray Don Mackey. On a cold night in mid-December, Carl Wayne and another thug named Lester Pruitt ambushed Ray Don outside a federal safe house in Hattiesburg. The plan was amateur hour from the start. No surveillance, no planning, just raw aggression and stupidity. They waited until Ray Don stepped outside for a cigarette, then opened fire with shotguns. Ray Don was hit multiple times and went down immediately. But the 2 U.S. Marshals guarding him returned fire, and the quiet suburban street erupted into a war zone. Carl Wayne and Lester killed both marshals before fleeing into the night, leaving 3 bodies bleeding out on the sidewalk. The murder of a federal witness and 2 U.S. Marshals brought the full weight of the federal government down on what was left of Billy. Sunday's operation, like the hammer of God. The plea deal evaporated instantly. The feds wanted blood now, and they wanted Billy Sunday to pay the ultimate price. Every available federal agent was mobilized. Roadblocks went up across 3 states. The manhunt for Carl Wayne Dupree and Lester Pruitt became a national news story. And Billy Sunday's name was front and center. Billy, still in his holding cell, watched the news coverage with growing horror. He hadn't ordered the hit. He hadn't even known Carl Wayne was planning it. But that didn't matter. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the media, this was Billy Sunday's doing. This was the logical conclusion of his reign of terror. The prosecution immediately moved to upgrade his charges, adding conspiracy to murder federal officers. The death penalty was now firmly on the table, and Billy's lawyers were scrambling to do damage control. Carl Wayne, Dupree, and Lester Pruitt were captured 72 hours later at a motel in Mobile, Alabama. They'd gotten drunk, gotten stupid, and gotten caught. Federal agents surrounded the motel, and after a tense standoff, both men surrendered. Lester Pruitt kept his mouth shut, but Carl Wayne, faced with multiple life sentences or the death penalty, started talking immediately. He told the feds everything, every detail of the Hattiesburg shooting, every conversation he'd had with other members of Billy's crew. And most damaging of all, he claimed that Billy had ordered the hit on Ray Don Mackey. It was a lie, but it didn't matter. Carl Wayne was desperate to save his own skin, and throwing Billy to the wolves was his only play. Billy's trial began on January 14, 1974, in a federal courthouse in Gulfport, Mississippi. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with reporters sitting in the aisles and overflow crowds gathered outside. Security was unprecedented. U.S. Marshals everywhere, metal detectors at every entrance, sharpshooters on the roof. The government was taking no chances. Prosecutor Mitchell Crane opened with a statement that lasted 90 minutes, laying out a decade of violence, corruption, and terror. He painted Billy Sunday as a monster, a cancer on Southern society, a man who'd left a trail of bodies from Mississippi to Florida. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They played wiretaps of Billy discussing drug shipments, ordering beatings, threatening witnesses. They brought in forensic accountants who traced hundreds of thousands of dollars from Billy's gambling operations through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. They showed photographs of crime scenes, bodies in shallow graves, burned-out buildings, victims who'd been tortured before they were killed. And they paraded witness after witness to the stand, each one adding another nail to Billy's coffin. The most damaging testimony came from Carl Wayne Dupree. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, Carl Wayne took the stand and sold out his former boss without hesitation. He described murders Billy had ordered, beatings Billy had personally carried out, deals Billy had orchestrated. He claimed that Billy had explicitly ordered the hit on Ray Don Mackey, that Billy had told him dead men don't testify. Billy's lawyers tore into Carl Wayne on cross-examination, pointing out his criminal history, his desperation to avoid the death penalty, his obvious willingness to say anything to save himself. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the testimony, and it corroborated everything else. The prosecution had presented. Billy's defense team did their best with a nearly impossible case. They argued that Billy was being scapegoated, that the federal government needed a villain to justify their massive investigation into Southern organized crime. They pointed out that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that many of the witnesses were career criminals with every reason to lie. They even put character witnesses on the stand, businessmen who'd known Billy, who testified that he'd always been polite and professional in their dealings. But it rang hollow. You can't polish a turd, and Billy Sunday's reputation was beyond salvaging. Billy himself never took the stand. His lawyers advised against it, knowing that the prosecution would tear him apart on cross-examination. So Billy sat silently at the defense table day after day, watching his life be dissected and destroyed. Sometimes he'd scribble notes for his attorneys. Sometimes he just stares at the jury, trying to read their faces, looking for any sign of sympathy or doubt. He found none. The jury looked at him with disgust, fear, or cold indifference. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a monster, and monsters don't deserve mercy. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented over 200 pieces of evidence and called 43 witnesses. The defense called 11 witnesses and rested their case in 3 days. On February 13, 1974, closing arguments began. Mitchell Crane spoke for 3 hours, summarizing the mountain of evidence, reminding the jury of the victims, demanding justice. Billy's lead attorney, a veteran criminal lawyer named Samuel Hightower, gave an impassioned closing that lasted 90 minutes, begging the jury to see Billy as a product of poverty and violence, a man who'd never had a chance. But even Hightower knew it was a losing battle. You could hear it in his voice, see it in his slumped shoulders. He was going through the motions, fulfilling his obligation. But the outcome was already decided. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 43 minutes. When they returned to the courtroom, not a single juror would look at Billy Sunday. That's how defendants know they're finished when the jury won't make eye contact. The foreman stood, and Judge Treadwell asked for the verdict. On all counts, the foreman said, his voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the exits. Federal agents smiled and shook hands. Billy Sunday sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his face a mask. He'd known it was coming, had prepared himself for it. but hearing the words still felt like a knife to the gut. His lawyers immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone in that courtroom knew it was over. Billy Sunday, the demon of the Gulf Coast, had been brought down. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. And those 2 weeks were the longest of Billy's life. He was transferred to a maximum security wing of the county jail, placed on suicide watch, and left alone with his thoughts. He didn't eat much. He didn't sleep well. He just lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. He'd been so careful, so ruthless, so smart. And yet here he was, finished at 33 years old, facing either life in prison or a date with the electric chair. On February 28, 1974, Billy Sunday was brought back to court for sentencing. The courtroom was even more packed than before, everyone wanting to witness the final chapter of the Billy Sunday saga. Prosecutor Mitchell Crane argued passionately for the death penalty, calling Billy a predator who deserves no mercy, no second chance, no leniency. Billy's attorneys begged for life imprisonment, arguing that Billy was still a young man who could potentially be rehabilitated, who didn't deserve to die for his crimes. Judge William Treadwell listened to both sides, then delivered his sentence. He sentenced Billy to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the racketeering and murder charges, plus an additional 90 years on drug and conspiracy charges, all sentences to run consecutively. He stopped short of the death penalty, citing Billy's age and the possibility, however remote, of rehabilitation. But the message was clear. Billy Sunday would never see the outside of a prison again. He would die behind bars, forgotten and alone, as the bailiffs led him away in chains. Billy turned and looked back at the courtroom one last time. The spectators, the reporters, the federal agents who'd brought him down, they all stared back at him. Some saw a monster finally caged. Others saw a tragic figure, a man destroyed by his own violence and ambition. Billy saw only strangers, people who'd never understood him, never walked in his shoes, never known what it meant to claw your way up from nothing, only to lose everything. Billy Sunday was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola 3 days later. The empire was gone. The legend was over. All that remained was the fall and the long, dark years ahead. Angola prison in the 1970s was hell on earth, and Billy Sunday had been sentenced to spend eternity there. The Louisiana State Penitentiary was an 18,000-acre sprawl of razor wire, guard towers, and human misery, a place where men were sent to be forgotten. For a man who'd once ruled the Gulf Coast underworld, who'd commanded fear with a glance and respect with a word, Angola was the ultimate humiliation. Billy Sunday was no longer a demon. He was prisoner number 84,627, just another aging convict in a sea of orange jumpsuits. The first few years were the hardest. Billy had enemies in Angola, men he'd crossed on the outside, family members of people he'd killed, rivals who saw an opportunity to settle old scores. Prison justice is swift and brutal, and Billy survived 2 separate attempts on his life in his first 18 months. The first was a shiv attack in the shower, a crude blade made from a sharpened toothbrush that slashed across his ribs. Billy fought back, breaking his attacker's jaw before the guards intervened. The second attempt was more calculated. Poison slipped into his food. Billy got violently ill, but survived, and after that, he stopped eating anything he didn't prepare himself. Paranoia, his old companion, followed him even behind bars. But Billy was a survivor, and Angola, for all its horrors, was still a world he understood. World of violence, hierarchy, and respect. Slowly, carefully, Billy began to rebuild his reputation. He aligned himself with a crew of older convicts, men who'd been in Angola for decades and knew how the system worked. He traded on his name, his stories, his legend. Young inmates, kids who'd grown up hearing tales of the Dixie Mafia, looked at Billy Sunday with a mixture of fear and awe. He became a fixture in the prison yard, a relic of a bygone era, the last of the old-school Southern outlaws. Outside Angola's walls, Billy Sunday's empire had collapsed completely. Without his leadership, the Dixie Mafia fragmented into feuding factions. Some of his former associates were arrested and imprisoned. Others were killed in power struggles. The Dixie Rose was raided by federal agents and shut down permanently, its basement drain finally exposed to the light. Billy's mansion on the Gulf Coast was seized by the government and auctioned off. The money, the cars, the mistresses, all of it evaporated like morning fog. The empire he'd built, paid for in blood and brutality, was erased in less than a year. Billy's name, however, lived on. In the criminal underworld of the South, Billy Sunday became a legend, a cautionary tale, and a dark inspiration. Younger criminals studied his rise and his fall, learning what to emulate and what to avoid. His brutality was admired. His paranoia and eventual betrayal were seen as lessons in trust. True crime writers and journalists began digging into his story, interviewing former associates, piecing together the bloody history of the Dixie Mafia. Books were written, documentaries were filmed. Billy Sunday, locked away in Angola, became more famous in prison than he'd ever been on the streets. Inside Angola, Billy adapted to the rhythm of prison life. He worked in the fields. Angola still operated as a working farm, a grim echo of its plantation past, and kept his head down. He avoided trouble when he could, but he never backed down from a fight. Respect in prison is everything, and Billy commanded it not through violence anymore, but through presence, through the weight of his past. He was a ghost of a more brutal time, and even the hardest convicts gave him space. As the years passed, Billy Sunday changed. Not in the way of redemption. There was no redemption for a man with his history, but in the way of resignation. He accepted his fate. He knew he would die in Angola, that the world outside had moved on without him. The South he'd terrorized was changing. The Dixie Mafia was a shadow of its former self, replaced by new criminal organizations with new methods. The old ways, Billy's ways, were obsolete. He was a dinosaur, and Angola was his tar pit. In interviews with journalists, rare, carefully controlled conversations arranged through the prison system, Billy was unrepentant. He never apologized for the violence, never expressed remorse for the lives he destroyed. "I did what I had to do to survive," he said in one interview in 1989. "The world I came from didn't have room for weakness. You were either the hammer or the nail, and I chose to be the hammer." When asked about the people he'd killed, Billy shrugged. "Every man I killed knew the rules. They knew what world they were in. You don't get to play the game and then cry about the consequences." Billy Sunday died in Angola on March 17, 2003, at the age of 63. The cause of death was liver cancer, a slow, painful end that took him over the course of 8 months. He refused chemotherapy, refused to fight it. Some said he was tired, that he'd lived too long in hell and was ready for whatever came next. Others said Billy Sunday never feared death. He'd stared it down too many times to be afraid of it now. He died alone in the prison hospital, no family by his side, no friends to mourn him. He was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave among hundreds of other forgotten men. So what is the legacy of Billy Sunday? What do we take from the story of a man who rose from nothing, built an empire on violence and fear, and died alone in a prison cell? The easy answer is that Billy Sunday was a monster, a sociopath who destroyed lives without hesitation or remorse. And that's true. He was all of those things, but he was also a product of his environment. A boy born into poverty and abuse who learned early that the world rewards the ruthless and punishes the weak. Billy Sunday's story is a mirror held up to a certain kind of American darkness the underbelly of the South, where poverty, corruption, and violence have always thrived beneath a veneer of respectability. He was a demon, yes, but he was a demon created by the very society that condemned him. He exploited a system that was already broken, profited from a world that had always been corrupt. For those who study organized crime, Billy Sunday represents the brutality and chaos of the Dixie Mafia, a criminal organization that lacked the structure of the Italian Mafia but was no less deadly. For those who study human psychology, he's a case study in trauma, violence, and the making of a killer. For the people of the Gulf Coast who lived through his reign of terror, he's a nightmare they'd rather forget. And for a certain breed of criminal, he's a legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones, a reminder of what it means to live and die by the gun. Billy Sunday was never a hero. He was never redeemed. But his story matters because it's real, because it happened, because men like him still exist in the shadows of every society. His legacy is written in the blood he spilled, in the lives he destroyed, in the fear he created. And in the end, that's all that remains, a name, a story, and a warning. The devil walked the back roads of the South, and his name was Billy Sunday. And though he died alone and forgotten in a prison cell, his bloody legacy still echoes through the pines and bayous. A reminder that some demons never truly die. They just wait in the darkness, ready to rise again. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark heart of the Dixie Mafia, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts on Billy Sunday's bloody legacy, and let me know what infamous gangster you want to hear about next. The underworld has many stories to tell, and we're just getting started. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.